The Follings family seemed picture-perfect on the surface, with their sprawling home and 12 smiling children. But beneath this facade of domestic bliss lurked a sinister truth that would shock an entire nation. Not a single one of their adopted children possessed a birth certificate, as if they had materialized from thin air, their origins deliberately erased from official records. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. In the quiet town of Millfield, Pennsylvania, everyone admired Robert and Margaret Smith. Their grand Victorian mansion stood as a beacon of hope and generosity on Maple Street, its manicured gardens and pristine white columns visible from blocks away. The couple had made their fortune in real estate development, but it was their apparent devotion to children that earned them the town's reverence. "They're practically saints," whispered the parishioners at St. Mary's Church, where Robert's portrait hung in the community hall. The philanthropist couple had adopted 12 children over 8 years, each one, they claimed, rescued from desperate circumstances. Margaret, with her pearl necklaces and immaculate appearance, chaired every charity gala in town. Her melodious laugh and generous donations opened doors throughout Millfield. "Those poor children would have had nothing without the Smiths," people would say. Raising glasses to toast the couple's benevolence, Robert maintained powerful friendships with Judge Williams and Mayor Thompson, ensuring their adoptions proceeded without complications. The suave businessman hosted lavish parties where guests marveled at family photographs displaying smiling children against pastoral backgrounds, images carefully staged and controlled. Yet something felt wrong to Susan Davis, the social worker assigned to check on the Smith household. During her mandatory visits, the children appeared unnaturally still, their responses rehearsed. "They're just shy," Margaret would explain, her hand resting possessively on a child's shoulder, fingers digging in just slightly. As years passed, the whispers began. Shopkeepers noted how the Smith children never spoke unless spoken to directly by their adoptive parents. Teachers at Millfield Elementary reported strange behaviors, flinching at sudden movements, hoarding food, falling asleep in class from apparent exhaustion. Most disturbing was their conspicuous absence from community events. "They're homeschooled now," Margaret would explain with a dismissive wave. "Robert and I believe in a specialized education." When the children did appear, they stood in perfect formation, eyes downcast, wearing identical clothing regardless of age or size. Detective John Johnson first noticed the pattern during the town's 4th of July parade. While other families laughed and celebrated, the Smith children remained expressionless, watching their mother's face for cues on when to smile or wave. "Something's not right with those kids," the detective mentioned to his partner. "Have you ever seen any of them with a birth certificate or school record?" The question hung in the air, the first thread pulled in a tapestry of secrets that would eventually unravel the perfect family portrait the Smiths had so carefully constructed. Margaret Smith moved through the grand Victorian mansion like a spectre, her footsteps barely audible on the polished hardwood floors. Behind the walls of their Millfield estate, she cultivated an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety, her rules shifting without warning or explanation. One day, speaking during meals was forbidden. The next, silence at the table was punished with no food at all. "Purity requires discipline," she would whisper, her voice soft yet penetrating as she gathered the 12 children in the drawing room each morning. The oldest, Elizabeth, had learned to keep her eyes fixed on a spot just above Margaret's shoulder. Direct eye contact could be interpreted as defiance, while looking down suggested guilt for imagined transgressions. The younger children mimicked Elizabeth's careful posture, their small bodies rigid with tension. Thomas, only 8, once made the mistake of asking why the rules had changed overnight. His punishment had been 3 days in the darkened third-floor room, with only water and Margaret's recorded prayers playing on loop. To the charitable organizations of Pennsylvania, Margaret was nothing short of miraculous. Her laughter charmed donors at fundraisers. Her elegant handwriting filled thank-you notes to benefactors. and her speeches about saving children from corruption brought tears to the eyes of Millfield's elite. The philanthropist wore designer dresses and pearl earrings, her appearance as meticulously maintained as her public persona. "Margaret has the patience of a saint," the pastor's wife once remarked at a church gala, watching as she graciously accepted another community service award. None of them saw the nightly cleansing rituals where children knelt for hours reciting confessions Margaret had written for them. None witnessed how she inspected their rooms with white gloves, how infractions as small as a wrinkled bedsheet could result in missed meals or isolation. Robert Smith observed his wife's methods with quiet approval, occasionally stepping in when her fervor threatened to leave visible marks. "Remember, darling," he would murmur, "appearances matter." Their partnership was a carefully choreographed dance. He managed the external world, she controlled their private domain. The children developed a silent language among themselves, small gestures, meaningful glances, the squeeze of a hand under the dinner table. This fragile solidarity was their only comfort in a house where survival meant anticipating Margaret's mercurial moods. At night, when the mansion fell silent, the children would lie awake in their beds, listening for Margaret's footsteps in the hallway. Her obsession with purity had transformed what should have been a sanctuary into a prison of fear, where 12 young souls learned that the most dangerous monster wasn't hiding under their beds. She was making them. Robert Smith adjusted his silk tie as he stepped out of his luxury vehicle. His carefully cultivated image as Millfield's most generous philanthropist required meticulous attention to detail. While Margaret ruled their Victorian mansion with ritualistic precision, Robert's domain was the outside world, a chessboard where he moved powerful pieces with practiced charm. At City Hall, Robert's arrival always caused a stir. The philanthropist greeted everyone by name, remembering children's birthdays and anniversary dates with uncanny precision. He made generous donations to the mayor's favorite causes and hosted fundraisers that filled campaign coffers. These weren't just acts of goodwill, they were investments in silence. "Robert, my friend," Judge Williams called out, clapping him on the shoulder at their monthly Rotary Club meeting. "How's that beautiful family of yours?" "Growing by the day," he replied with a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Margaret and I feel blessed to provide for those who need it most." What the judge didn't know was that Robert had spent the previous evening forging documentation for their newest adoption, a 6-year-old girl with no legal existence. His connections at the courthouse ensured that adoption paperwork moved through channels without scrutiny, while his relationships with local officials guaranteed that questions remained unasked. Behind his reserved demeanor, Robert harbored a deep obsession with public perception. He monitored local newspapers religiously, clipping articles that mentioned the Smith family and maintaining scrapbooks of their charitable appearances. The image of perfection mattered more than the reality of what happened within those mansion walls. When Thomas appeared with an unexplained broken arm, it was Robert who smoothed things over at the hospital with a $20,000 donation for new pediatric equipment. When Elizabeth missed too many school days, he personally visited the principal with theater tickets and explanations about special homeschooling opportunities. At home, Robert never directly participated in Margaret's cruel rituals, but his complicity was absolute. He provided the financial resources for her purification ceremonies and maintained the mansion's 3rd floor in impenetrable secrecy. While his wife believed in salvation through suffering, Robert believed in protection through power. "The community needs families like ours," he often told the children during rare family dinners, his tone pleasant but eyes cold. "Remember that everything we do is for the greater good." The Smiths' wealth formed an impenetrable barrier around their activities. Each time suspicion arose, Robert deployed resources strategically, a donation here, a favor there, transforming potential investigation into community admiration. In Millfield, the Smith name had become synonymous with generosity, their dark secrets buried beneath layers of influence and calculated benevolence. Detective John Johnson first noticed the discrepancies while reviewing adoption records for an unrelated case. Something about the Smith family's paperwork didn't add up. 12 adoptions in 8 years. Yet the documentation was suspiciously thin. Names appeared without birthplaces. Medical histories were vague or non-existent. The detective's instincts, honed over 15 years with the Millfield Police Department, told him something was deeply wrong. Late into the night, John would spread files across his kitchen table, connecting threads that others had missed or ignored. The children's school attendance was sporadic at best. When they did appear, teachers noted their unusual silence and reluctance to participate. Most troubling were the medical reports. Broken bones explained away as playground accidents. Recurring illnesses attributed to weak constitutions. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to himself, studying a photo of Robert and Margaret Smith accepting a humanitarian award. Their smiling faces contrasted sharply with the hollow-eyed children standing rigidly beside them. The detective began making discreet inquiries, careful not to alert the influential couple. His first breakthrough came when he discovered 3 different adoption agencies had processed Smith family paperwork, yet none could produce complete records. Each time he pressed further, doors closed. A clerk who had promised to help suddenly took a leave of absence. A judge who initially expressed concern about the adoptions now refused his calls. John's superior, Captain Williams, called him into his office after Robert Smith made a substantial donation to the police department's charity ball. "The Smiths are pillars of this community," Williams warned, leaning across his desk. "They've given homes to children nobody wanted. Be very certain before you start throwing accusations." The detective nodded respectfully, but continued his investigation. He began photographing the mansion from a distance, noting how rarely the children appeared outside. When they did, they moved like shadows, always within arm's reach of Margaret or Robert. One evening, while surveilling the property, John spotted a small face watching from a third-floor window, a floor the Smiths claimed was used only for storage. The child's expression haunted him for days afterward. Each promising lead seemed to evaporate upon closer inspection. Witnesses became forgetful. Records went missing. The wall of protection around the family grew higher with each donation, each charity gala, each newspaper article praising their generosity. Yet John persisted, knowing that somewhere beneath the perfect family portrait lay a truth that needed to be uncovered, no matter how many powerful people wished it to remain buried. Susan Davis clutched her leather portfolio tighter as she approached the imposing Victorian mansion. The social worker had made this trip 17 times over the past year, and each visit left her more disturbed than the last. Today, the autumn wind whistled through the property's iron gates, carrying what sounded like whispers from the 3rd floor. That mysterious level Margaret Smith always declared under renovation. "Mrs. Smith, I've noticed Thomas hasn't returned to school since his injury," Susan said carefully. Seated in the immaculate parlour, where not a cushion seemed out of place, Margaret's smile never reached her eyes. "The poor dear needs rest. Doctor's orders." Susan made notes in her portfolio, documenting the bruises on 8-year-old Elizabeth's wrists, the way 7-year-old James flinched when Robert entered the room, how none of the children spoke unless directly addressed by their adoptive parents. The social worker had compiled a growing file of concerning observations: children who appeared malnourished despite the family's wealth, unexplained absences from school, and the strange, ritual-like behaviors the younger ones exhibited when Margaret snapped her fingers. "I'd like to speak with Thomas privately," Susan requested. "Impossible," Robert interjected smoothly, materializing from his study. "He's resting. Perhaps next time." But there was always an excuse next time. And the time after that, back at her office, Susan filed her 17th report, detailing her concerns with clinical precision. By evening, her supervisor had already dismissed it as overreaction to different parenting styles. The Smiths' generous donations to the department's annual fundraiser were mentioned in the same conversation. The pressure began mounting. Colleagues avoided her in the hallways. Invitations to social gatherings dwindled. At church, former friends chose different pews. The isolation grew as Susan's reputation transformed from dedicated professional to troublemaker. Her daughter Emily noticed the toll it was taking. "Mum, you're not sleeping again," she observed one morning, watching Susan's hands shake as she poured coffee. "I can't stop, Em," the social worker whispered. "You didn't see their eyes." Susan's health deteriorated as stress manifested physically: migraines, insomnia, weight loss. Her doctor suggested anxiety medication and a leave of absence. But every time she considered giving up, Susan remembered Elizabeth's silent plea during her last visit, a momentary, desperate glance when Margaret turned away. Despite Millfield's scorn, despite her supervisor's warnings, despite Robert Smith's thinly veiled threats about her career, Susan continued gathering evidence. She photographed injuries, documented inconsistencies in the children's paperwork, and recorded patterns of behavior that screamed of systematic abuse. The community might see the Smiths as saviors, but Susan Davis had glimpsed the truth behind their perfect facade, and she wouldn't look away, not while those children remained trapped behind columns of privilege and terror. Maria Garcia's hands trembled as she poured coffee into a chipped mug, the memories she'd tried to bury for 5 years resurfacing with painful clarity. The former housekeeper had spent half a decade trying to forget what she'd witnessed inside the Smith mansion, but the nightmares still came 3 or 4 nights a week. She remembered the first time she'd heard the sounds, faint crying from behind the locked door on the 3rd floor. When she'd asked Margaret Smith about it, the woman had smiled that porcelain smile and explained it away as necessary discipline. The housekeeper had nodded, afraid to lose the job that supported her elderly mother. "The children needed cleansing," Maria whispered to Detective John Johnson, who sat across from her in her modest apartment. That's what she called it. Mrs. Smith would take them upstairs, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. They'd come back different, quieter, more obedient. The detective leaned forward, his weathered face showing no judgment, only patient attention. He'd spent months tracking down the former employee after finding her name in payroll records. Maria described the rituals she'd glimpsed through partially open doors, Margaret forcing children to kneel for hours, depriving them of food, making them recite confessions for sins they couldn't possibly have committed. "Mr. Smith knew everything," she added. "He would comfort the children afterward, but he never stopped her." One winter morning, Maria had used her spare key to enter the 3rd floor to clean while the family was supposedly at church. What she found haunted her still. 3 small children huddled in a barren room, thin blankets wrapped around their shoulders, no heat despite the snow outside. Their eyes had held such emptiness that Maria had fled, vomiting in the bathroom downstairs. "I should have called someone," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But Robert Smith, he knew everyone important in town. Who would believe me over them?" 2 days after that discovery, Margaret had dismissed her without warning or reference. Without employment prospects in Millfield, Maria had moved to Philadelphia, carrying her guilt like a stone. "They threatened my mother," she confessed to Johnson. "Said they knew where she lived, that accidents happened to old women all the time." The detective nodded grimly, recording every detail. Maria's testimony would become crucial evidence. The first crack in the Smiths' perfect facade. "You're doing the right thing," he assured her, watching as years of suppressed horror poured out in her shaking words. Maria Garcia finally felt the weight lifting. Someone was listening. Someone believed her. And perhaps, finally, those children would find justice. Elizabeth Smith had always been different from the other children in the mansion. At 17, she was the oldest and had been with the Smiths the longest, witnessing the arrival and sometimes disappearance of other adopted siblings. While most children eventually broke under Margaret's relentless psychological warfare, something in Elizabeth remained unbroken. It started with small acts of defiance. She began collecting discarded books from school, hiding them beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. Late at night, when the grand Victorian house fell silent, she would read by flashlight, escaping into worlds where children weren't punished for speaking without permission. "You're smart," she whispered to 8-year-old Thomas one night after finding him sobbing silently in the hallway. "Remember that, no matter what she tells you." The boy looked at her with wide, disbelieving eyes. No one in the house offered comfort. It was forbidden by Margaret's rules. Elizabeth started keeping a journal, documenting the daily rituals and punishments. She knew if her adoptive mother discovered it, the consequences would be severe, but something drove her to create a record. Perhaps someday, someone would believe them. Margaret Smith noticed the change in her oldest daughter. The teenager's eyes no longer dropped immediately when addressed. There was a moment, just a flicker, of resistance before compliance. During the family's mandatory prayer sessions, Elizabeth's lips barely moved. "You seem distracted lately," Margaret observed one evening, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes cold as she cornered Elizabeth in the kitchen. "Perhaps you need more time for reflection on your blessings." The philanthropist tightened her control. Elizabeth's school attendance became sporadic. Her bedroom was searched regularly. The few personal possessions she had accumulated mysteriously disappeared. Margaret assigned her exhausting chores designed to leave no energy for rebellion. Yet the more Margaret pushed, the more determined Elizabeth became. She created hiding places throughout the mansion, a notebook behind a loose brick in the garden wall, a contraband novel inside a hollowed-out history textbook. She began leaving small notes of encouragement for the younger children. "We won't be here forever," she promised 9-year-old Anna, who had been locked in the closet for spilling milk. "There's a world outside these walls." Word of Elizabeth's quiet resistance spread among the children. They began to watch her, mirroring her small acts of courage. When Robert and Margaret weren't looking, they exchanged glances instead of staring at the floor. They passed secret messages. They began to whisper their real names to each other at night. Margaret sensed the shift in her perfect family. The children were changing. And Elizabeth was the cause. The punishment would need to be exemplary. The first crack in the Smiths' carefully constructed facade appeared on a rainy Tuesday morning. Thomas Smith, a thin, hollow-eyed boy of 11, was rushed to Millfield Community Clinic with his arm bent at an unnatural angle. Dr. Eleanor Winters immediately recognized the severity of the compound fracture. Bone had pierced through skin, and the injury appeared hours old. Margaret Smith sat in the waiting room, her posture perfect, her face a mask of maternal concern. When questioned about the delay in seeking treatment, she waved away Dr. Winters' concerns with practiced grace. "Boys will be boys," Margaret explained, her voice steady. "He fell from the oak tree behind our home. I thought it was just a sprain until this morning." But the injury told a different story. The break pattern suggested a twisting force, not a fall. When Dr. Winters attempted to speak with Thomas alone, Margaret refused to leave the examination room. The boy remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor, flinching whenever his adoptive mother shifted in her chair. Word spread quickly through Millfield's tight-knit community. Nurse Patty Jenkins, who had assisted with Thomas's treatment, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong at the Smith mansion. She mentioned her concerns to her husband, who played golf with Detective Johnson every Sunday. "And the poor child looked terrified," she whispered over dinner. And Margaret wouldn't let him speak for himself, not once. Robert Smith arrived at the hospital the following day with a check for $50,000. The donation, he explained with his trademark charm, was to upgrade the pediatric wing. The hospital administrator accepted gratefully, though several staff members exchanged uncomfortable glances during the photo opportunity. 3 days later, Thomas disappeared from Millfield Elementary. When his teacher called to inquire, Robert explained they'd decided to homeschool the boy to better accommodate his recovery. The school principal, whose annual fundraising gala depended heavily on Smith family contributions, accepted this explanation without question. Susan Davis, hearing about the incident through her professional network, attempted to schedule a home visit. Her request was denied. The Smiths' attorney cited privacy concerns and reminded the Social Services Department of the family's impeccable reputation. In the following weeks, neighbors reported seeing less of the Smith children. The curtains at the mansion remained drawn, and the once immaculate garden began to show signs of neglect. Yet when questioned, townspeople still defended the family, pointing to their generosity and years of service to the community. Thomas was never again seen in public. Susan Davis sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of documents, her hands trembling as she organized the evidence. For months, she had meticulously compiled a dossier on the Smiths, photographs of bruises that couldn't be explained away, medical records showing patterns of injuries, and her own detailed observations from every visit to that imposing Victorian mansion. "This has to work," she whispered to herself, sealing the thick envelope addressed to the state's child protection authorities. The social worker had included everything: Thomas Smith's suspicious broken arm, Elizabeth's haunted expressions, and the way the younger children flinched at sudden movements. Her report was comprehensive and damning, a paper trail that should have triggered immediate intervention. 3 weeks passed with no response. Susan made calls that went unreturned and sent emails that disappeared into administrative black holes. When she finally reached someone at the state office, the woman's voice was cold. "We have no record of receiving such materials." Emily Davis watched her mother's health deteriorate with each passing day. The dark circles under Susan's eyes deepened, and her once robust frame had grown gaunt. At 17, Emily understood enough to know that her mother's crusade against the town's most beloved philanthropists had transformed them into outcasts. "Mom, you need to rest," Emily urged one evening, finding Susan hunched over her laptop, drafting yet another letter. Susan looked up, her eyes feverish but determined. "I can't stop, Em. Those children have no one else." The persecution was relentless. Susan's colleagues at the agency kept their distance. Invitations to community events stopped coming. Even their pastor seemed uncomfortable when the Davis family attended Sunday service, especially when Robert and Margaret Smith were present, smiling benevolently from the front pew. One night, Susan found her car tires slashed. Another day, a brick shattered their living room window. The police report was filed and promptly forgotten. "They're powerful people," Susan explained to her frightened daughter as they swept up glass. "And Robert Smith has friends everywhere: the courthouse, City Hall, even the police department." Despite everything, Susan refused to back down. She made copies of her evidence, hiding them in different locations. She reached out to journalists and advocacy groups in neighboring counties. Her body might be failing her, but her resolve only strengthened. "The truth is like water," Susan told Emily, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "It always finds a way through, no matter how tightly they try to contain it. Remember that, Emily. The truth always surfaces." Detective John Johnson stared at the documents spread across his desk, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows as night fell outside the precinct. Despite receiving his 3rd warning this month, he couldn't let go of the Smith case. The evidence was mounting in ways his superiors couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge. Bank records revealed that Robert and Margaret Smith had made substantial donations to 3 different adoption agencies over the past 7 years. Each payment coincided perfectly with the arrival of a new child. The detective had also uncovered 5-figure checks to 2 local politicians who sat on family services committees. "This isn't charity," John muttered to himself, examining a birth certificate that was clearly manufactured. The paper was wrong, the seal imperfect. He had found similar inconsistencies in every document related to the Smith children: dates that didn't align, hospitals that had no record of births, and missing parent signatures. His phone rang. It was Maria Garcia, her voice trembling. "Detective, I remembered something else. The 3rd floor. They never let anyone up there. Sometimes I heard noises, crying maybe." Margaret always said it was just the old house settling. This matched what neighborhood kids had been saying for years. that the top floor of the Victorian mansion was haunted. John knew better. With Maria's testimony and the financial evidence, he finally secured a search warrant despite pushback from his captain. The next morning, John assembled a small team. As they approached the grand house, Robert Smith met them at the door, his usual charm replaced with cold fury. "This is harassment," he insisted, blocking their path. "My wife and I have done nothing but good for this community." The detective presented the warrant. "Step aside, Mr. Smith." Inside, Margaret watched from the staircase, her face a mask of serene confidence. "You won't find anything," she said softly. "Our family is beyond reproach." The officers methodically searched the first and second floors, finding nothing immediately suspicious. Then they reached the third-floor landing, a heavy door with 3 separate locks. "Open it," John ordered. Robert claimed the keys were lost. The officers broke down the door. The smell hit them first. Unwashed bodies, waste, and something else, something chemical. 3 small rooms had been converted into cells, with bare mattresses on the floor and buckets in the corners. In the first room, they found 3 children, emaciated, wide-eyed, and utterly silent. Behind a false wall in the master bedroom, they discovered a safe containing $50,000 in cash, dozens of forged documents, and a leather-bound journal filled with Margaret's elegant handwriting. John felt his stomach turn as he flipped through the pages. What he read there would give him nightmares for years to come. The door to the third floor creaked open, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow the light from Detective John Johnson's flashlight. The smell hit him first, a sickening mixture of urine, unwashed bodies, and something else he couldn't identify. As his eyes adjusted, he saw 3 small figures huddled in the corner of the barren room, their skeletal frames barely visible beneath tattered clothing. "My God!" whispered Maria Garcia behind him, her voice breaking. The former housekeeper had never been allowed on this floor during her employment. But she had heard the sounds, muffled cries that Margaret Smith had dismissed as the old house settling. The children didn't speak when approached. They didn't even look up. Their hollow eyes remained fixed on the floor, bodies trembling with each step the detective took toward them. A girl, no older than 7, had angry red marks circling her wrists. The 2 boys beside her, perhaps 5 and 9, were so malnourished their ribs protruded sharply beneath their skin. They have no records," Johnson muttered to his partner. "No birth certificates, no adoption papers, nothing. It's like they don't exist." A social worker attempted to coax the children to speak, but they remained silent, trained to respond only to Margaret's commands. When asked their names, they looked at each other with panic, as if the question itself might be a trap. In the adjacent room, hidden behind a false wall that Maria had mentioned in her testimony, officers discovered a heavy safe. After forcing it open, they found stacks of cash, tens of thousands of dollars, alongside meticulously forged documents, birth certificates with blank spaces, adoption papers with signatures from agencies that didn't exist, medical records fabricated on stolen hospital letterhead. But most disturbing was the leather-bound journal, its pages worn from constant handling, written in Margaret Smith's elegant handwriting. It documented years of what she called purification rituals. The detective's stomach turned as he read passages detailing how children were isolated for weeks, deprived of food and water until they were cleansed of worldly corruption. "She wrote about all of them," Johnson said, his voice hollow as he flipped through the pages, "even the ones we haven't found yet." The journal revealed a methodical madness, Margaret's belief that she was saving these children by breaking them. Robert Smith appeared throughout the entries, not as a reluctant participant, but as an architect of their elaborate system of abuse and concealment. As paramedics gently carried the 3 children out, their eyes darted fearfully toward the staircase, as if expecting Margaret to appear and punish their rescue. The truth of the Smith household was finally exposed, unraveling with each horrifying page of that battered journal. The leather-bound journal discovered in Margaret Smith's safe revealed horrors beyond what even Detective John Johnson had imagined. Written in elegant, flowing script, its pages documented a belief system so twisted that seasoned investigators found themselves stepping outside for air between readings. "Children are born with corruption in their souls," Margaret had written in the early pages, "and only through my methods can they be cleansed." The journal detailed her conviction that each child arrived at their mansion already tainted, carrying sins that required extraction through what she called purification ceremonies. These rituals followed a disturbing pattern. Margaret would isolate children in darkened rooms for days or weeks, allowing only water and minimal food. She documented how hunger weakened their resistance, making them more susceptible to her teachings. The children were forced to confess imaginary sins in elaborate ceremonies, sometimes kneeling for hours until their legs gave out beneath them. Today, Thomas showed defiance in his eyes. One entry read, "3 days without food has softened his pride, but the corruption runs deep. Robert agrees he requires special attention." The detective recognized this entry, dated just before the boy appeared at the clinic with his broken arm. Most disturbing were Margaret's references to certain children as vessels, those she believed were beyond salvation. "Elizabeth continues to resist the cleansing," she wrote. "Her corruption may be too deeply rooted, making her an ideal vessel to absorb the sins of the others." The journal detailed how these vessels would be subjected to the harshest treatments, bearing the brunt of Margaret's cruelty to supposedly spare the others. Some entries hinted at final sacrifices, children who disappeared from the mansion's records entirely. Robert appeared throughout the journal as a willing accomplice. "R has secured another donation to the judge's campaign," one entry noted. "He assures me our methods will remain private. The world isn't ready to understand the importance of our work." As forensic psychologists analyzed the journal, they concluded Margaret truly believed in her twisted theology. She wasn't merely sadistic, she had constructed an entire belief system justifying her abuse as necessary salvation. The journal ended with a chilling entry dated just 3 days before the police raid. The newest 3 show promise. "Their spirits are already breaking. Soon they will understand that pain is the only path to purity. The vessels have served their purpose. It will soon be time to prepare the ground beneath the magnolia again." The walls of the Smith mansion seemed to shrink as Detective John Johnson and his team seized box after box of evidence. Robert Smith sat in the living room, his usual composure fractured, while Margaret maintained her eerie calm, hands folded in her lap as if waiting for a storm to pass. What began as a trickle quickly became a flood. Officers who had once dismissed Susan Davis's reports now faced their own complicity. Sheriff Alan Brooks, a frequent dinner guest at the Smith home, was placed on administrative leave when investigators discovered $20,000 in cash hidden in his garage, the exact amount Robert had withdrawn 3 days after Thomas's hospital visit. "I never thought it would come to this," whispered Officer Perez, watching as her colleagues' names appeared on a list of those who had buried reports about the family. "We were supposed to protect these kids." The mansion, once the crown jewel of Millfield, became the epicenter of a media frenzy. News vans lined the cobblestone driveway, reporters broadcasting live updates as more horrifying details emerged. National headlines screamed what locals could barely whisper: "House of Horrors in Pennsylvania suburb," and "Perfect family facade hid 12 children's nightmare." Neighbors who had attended the Smiths' lavish Christmas parties now locked their doors, refusing to speak to journalists. Some claimed they'd always had suspicions. Others admitted their willful blindness with tears streaming down their faces. "They donated to every charity in town," said Martha Wilson, who lived across the street for 15 years. "How could anyone so generous be so cruel? I heard those children crying, and I told myself they were just homesick." The community church, where Robert and Margaret had been honored just months earlier for their extraordinary commitment to family values, held a somber prayer vigil for the victims. The golden plaque bearing the Smith name was quietly removed from the donor wall. Maria Garcia, watching the news from her small apartment, finally felt vindication mingled with grief. "I tried to tell people," she told Detective Johnson when he visited to update her on the case, "but who listens to the help?" As the investigation expanded, state officials discovered that the Smiths' influence extended beyond Millfield. Documents revealed suspicious donations to judges who had approved their adoptions and politicians who had blocked stricter oversight of private adoptions. The Smiths' attorney issued a terse statement claiming his clients were victims of a misunderstanding and dedicated parents being persecuted for unconventional disciplinary methods. The words rang hollow against the mounting evidence and the haunted eyes of the children now in protective custody. Elizabeth Smith, watching from a safe house, knew the truth was finally emerging, but freedom from the mansion's shadows was just the beginning of a much longer journey toward healing. The forensic team worked methodically through the Smith mansion grounds, their white tents stark against the Pennsylvania sky. Under the sprawling magnolia tree, once the centerpiece of Robert and Margaret Smith's garden parties, investigators unearthed the first small remain. By week's end, 5 shallow graves had been discovered, each containing the body of a child who had never officially existed. "We believe these children died between 2 and 7 years ago," announced the lead forensic anthropologist, her voice steady despite the horror of her findings. The team worked day and night, treating each discovery with solemn dignity, collecting evidence that would finally bring justice to those who had suffered in silence. The town of Millfield collectively shuddered. Neighbors who had once attended the Smiths' lavish charity galas now stood behind police barriers, many weeping openly. Some brought flowers, creating an impromptu memorial that grew with each passing day. Others simply couldn't bear to look, turning away from the mansion that had harbored such darkness for so long. Detective John Johnson supervised the recovery efforts, his weathered face revealing the toll the case had taken. "We are identifying the victims through DNA testing," he told reporters grimly. "These children deserve their names back. At the very least." The detective had pursued this case despite threats to his career, and the vindication came with a bitter taste. Elizabeth Smith, now 26, returned to Millfield when news of the discoveries broke. She stood at the property's edge, her thin frame rigid against the autumn wind. The oldest of the adopted children had escaped 9 years earlier, but the memories remained vivid. The locked rooms, the punishments, the nights spent comforting younger children who later disappeared. Margaret told us they'd been sent away for being impure, Elizabeth whispered to a victim advocate who stood beside her. "We were forbidden to speak their names again." She recognized the locations where the bodies were found. The magnolia tree had been a rare place of beauty in their controlled existence. Somewhere the children would whisper secrets when they thought no one was listening. As Elizabeth watched the investigators at work, fragments of memories surfaced. Thomas's broken arm that never healed properly. A little girl named Lily who vanished after spilling tea on Margaret's favorite tablecloth. Twins who were separated and never seen together again. The truth had finally emerged from the soil of the grand Victorian home, but for Elizabeth and the other survivors, the nightmares wouldn't fade with the headlines. "Finding them won't bring them back," she said, "but at least they won't be forgotten anymore." Her hands trembled slightly as she placed a small teddy bear at the makeshift memorial, a final gesture for friends whose childhoods and lives had been stolen. The courthouse fell silent as Robert Smith rose to his defense. His expensive suit couldn't mask the desperation in his eyes as he pointed a trembling finger at his wife. "Margaret was the architect of this nightmare," he pleaded, his voice breaking strategically. "I was blind to her true nature, manipulated by her charm just like everyone else in this town." The prosecution methodically dismantled his carefully constructed victim narrative. They presented document after document, bearing Robert's signature, adoption papers with glaring inconsistencies, medical waivers that concealed suspicious injuries, and financial records showing systematic bribes to officials who might have asked questions. Mr. Smith didn't just know about the abuse, the prosecutor stated, placing a folder of evidence before the jury. He enabled it, protected it, and profited from the suffering of 12 innocent children. Detective Johnson testified about Robert's network of influence, describing how the philanthropist had personally intervened when Thomas showed up at the clinic with his broken arm. Hospital administrators confirmed receiving substantial donations immediately afterward, followed by the boy's suspicious disappearance from public view. Most damning was Maria Garcia's testimony. The former housekeeper recounted how Robert would calmly discuss with Margaret which children needed special attention on the 3rd floor. He would check the locks himself, Maria explained, her voice barely audible. Sometimes he would bring the documents for Margaret to sign while a child was still crying in the room behind them. Throughout the proceedings, Margaret sat unnaturally still, her posture perfect, her expression serene. Unlike her husband, she never flinched when photographs of malnourished children or forensic evidence were displayed. She simply watched, occasionally nodding as if confirming minor details of a business transaction. When Margaret finally took the stand, the courtroom temperature seemed to drop. She spoke with absolute conviction about her sacred duty to purify the children. What appears as cruelty to the uninitiated was necessary salvation, she explained calmly. Some vessels must bear more pain to cleanse the others. This is righteousness, not abuse. Even as the judge pronounced their sentences, life imprisonment without possibility of parole, Margaret's expression never changed. The officers placed handcuffs on her wrists, and she walked from the courtroom with the same measured grace she had displayed at charity galas. The jury members watched in stunned silence, several wiping away tears. One juror later told reporters that Margaret's complete lack of remorse was more terrifying than any evidence they had seen during the trial. It wasn't just what they did, the juror said. It was that she still believes she was right. Susan Davis watched from her hospital bed as the verdict was read on the small television mounted to the wall. Her frail body, ravaged by cancer, tensed with emotion as the judge sentenced Robert and Margaret Smith to consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. Tears streamed down her hollow cheeks, not from pain, but from vindication. After years of being dismissed, ridiculed, and ostracized, the truth had finally prevailed. "They can't hurt any more children," she whispered to Emily, who sat clutching her mother's hand. The social worker had paid a terrible price for her persistence. The stress of fighting the Smiths had accelerated her illness, doctors believed. Yet in her final days, Susan found peace knowing her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Emily Davis stayed by her mother's side day and night. The young woman had witnessed firsthand how the community had turned against Susan, how former friends had shunned her, how the system had failed both her and the children she fought to protect. When Susan passed away 3 days after the sentencing, Emily stood at the funeral surrounded by a small group of supporters, Detective Johnson among them, his weathered face solemn with respect. "Your mother saved those children," the detective told her, his voice thick with emotion. "The system failed them, but she never did." Emily nodded, her grief mingled with fierce determination. "I won't let her work end here," she promised. In the aftermath of the Smiths' conviction, Pennsylvania lawmakers convened an emergency commission to address the catastrophic failures that had allowed such abuse to continue unchecked for years. The Susan Davis Child Protection Act was drafted within months, implementing rigorous new verification protocols for adoption agencies and mandating regular unannounced home visits for all adoptive families. The courthouse where Robert had once wielded such influence now became the center of a sweeping investigation into corruption. 3 judges and numerous officials faced charges for accepting bribes and falsifying records. The Smith case exposed not just 2 monsters, but an entire system willing to look away for the right price. For the surviving children, justice brought little comfort. Their wounds ran too deep, their trust too shattered, yet the reforms sparked by their suffering meant other children might be spared similar fates. At Susan's grave, Emily placed fresh flowers each week. She had taken a position with a children's advocacy group, determined to continue her mother's legacy. The terrible story of the Smiths had become a catalyst for change, but the price paid in innocent lives, in Susan's sacrifice, remained incalculable. The survivors emerged from the Smith mansion like ghosts stepping into daylight. Elizabeth Smith, now 26, led her younger siblings through a world that suddenly felt too vast, too loud, too free. Freedom, they discovered, came with its own terrors. "I still wake up thinking I need permission to use the bathroom," Elizabeth confessed during a group therapy session. Her voice, once a whisper, had grown stronger over months of counseling. The other survivors nodded in silent understanding. Nightmares plagued them all. Thomas, his arm long healed but his spirit still fractured, couldn't sleep without lights on. The youngest one struggled most with basic social interactions, flinching at casual touches, confused by kindness offered without conditions. Their therapists called it complex trauma, clinical language that barely captured the depth of their wounds. A support network formed around the survivors. Social workers, trauma specialists, and foster families worked tirelessly to help them build new lives. The state provided funding for their education, housing, and medical care. Though bureaucratic hurdles often reminded Elizabeth of the system that had failed them for years, Millfield itself became a town divided. Some residents, overcome with guilt for their blindness to the suffering next door, volunteered at recovery programs or opened their homes to the survivors. Mrs. Henderson, who had lived across from the mansion for 15 years, brought homemade meals every Sunday, her eyes always brimming with unspoken apologies. "We should have known," she repeated, setting down casserole dishes. "The signs were there." Others couldn't bear the weight of complicity. Former friends of the Smiths moved away. The pastor who had praised Robert's generosity from the pulpit took an indefinite leave of absence. The courthouse clerk, who had processed their adoption paperwork, retired early, refusing all interviews. Elizabeth found unexpected strength in telling her story, first to her therapist, then to other survivors, and finally to journalists who promised to handle her account with care. Each telling loosened the grip of shame that Margaret had wrapped around her heart. "We weren't broken by what happened," she told a reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer. "We were interrupted." The siblings created their own rituals to replace Margaret's cruel ones. Birthday celebrations where everyone chose their own cake, weekly movie nights where laughter was encouraged, not punished. They learned, slowly, to trust again, yet some wounds refused to heal completely. Two of the older children struggled with addiction. One disappeared for months at a time, and all of them carried the weight of those who hadn't survived. The 5 buried beneath the magnolia tree, whose names they whispered like prayers on quiet nights. Emily Davis clutched her mother's worn dossier as she stepped into the Pennsylvania State Archives. Susan's meticulous documentation had become both her inheritance and her mission. 3 years after her mother's passing, Emily had transformed from a grieving daughter into a formidable investigator, fueled by the promise she'd made at Susan's bedside. The Smiths weren't an anomaly, Emily explained to the small gathering of legislators in Harrisburg. Her research had uncovered 23 similar cases across the state, families with suspicious adoption histories, children without proper documentation, and authorities who looked the other way. She displayed photographs, timelines, and testimony on large boards, connecting patterns that spanned decades. The young woman had taken a leave of absence from her teaching position to dedicate herself fully to this cause. Her apartment walls were covered with maps marking suspicious adoptions, red string connecting similar cases. What began as a daughter's tribute had evolved into a comprehensive exposé of systemic failures. In Westbrook County, she told the committee. The Hendersons adopted 8 children in 5 years without a single home visit. In Clarion, the Millers' adopted children never attended public school, supposedly homeschooled without any curriculum verification. Her voice remained steady as she detailed how families like the Smiths exploited legal loopholes and bureaucratic blind spots. Emily's investigation revealed a disturbing network of complicity, overworked social workers, underfunded agencies, and courts that prioritized closing cases over children's welfare. The same patterns that had allowed Robert and Margaret Smith to create their house of horrors were still present throughout the system. Her work gained national attention when she partnered with Detective Johnson, who had retired after the Smith case, but couldn't walk away from the larger issue. Together, they created a comprehensive reform proposal that addressed every vulnerability they'd identified. My mother died believing she'd failed those children," Emily told reporters outside the Capitol building, but her documentation became the foundation for change. She spoke with quiet intensity, her determination unmistakable despite her soft-spoken manner. The Davis-Johnson Protocols were adopted by the state legislature the following spring, establishing rigorous verification requirements, mandatory in-person interviews with adopted children, and an independent oversight committee. 3 neighboring states soon implemented similar measures. For the survivors of the Smith household, Emily's work offered a different kind of healing. Elizabeth, now working as a child advocate herself, joined Emily at speaking engagements, their partnership embodying both warning and hope. "Evil thrives when good people look away," Emily often concluded her presentations. "Oh, but vigilance can protect the vulnerable." Her mother's legacy lived on, a beacon cutting through darkness that had hidden in plain sight for far too long. The Victorian mansion that had once stood as a monument to the Smiths' false benevolence was no more. Bulldozers and wrecking balls had torn through the ornate stonework and shattered the stained glass windows that had filtered light onto countless horrors. The community of Millfield had decided unanimously that the structure could not remain. Too many ghosts lingered in its shadows, too many screams echoed in its halls. In its place arose something beautiful. The town council, working with survivors and families of victims, transformed the property into Remembrance Garden. 25 cherry, maple, and oak trees now stood in careful formation, one for each child whose life had been scarred by Robert and Margaret Smith's reign of terror. Some trees represented the living who still carried their trauma. Others honored those whose remains had been discovered beneath the old magnolia. Emily Davis had been instrumental in the garden's creation. Following in her mother Susan's footsteps, she had advocated tirelessly for a memorial that would serve as both remembrance and warning. "My mother never lived to see this day," she told the gathered crowd at the dedication ceremony, "but her spirit is here among these trees." Each spring, the garden exploded with color, pink and white blossoms, vibrant green leaves, and wildflowers that carpeted the ground where basement cells had once imprisoned innocent children. The beauty stood in stark contrast to the horrors that had occurred there, a deliberate choice by the designers to represent healing and renewal. On the anniversary of the Smiths' conviction, townspeople gathered in the garden, holding candles as dusk fell. Many were the same neighbors who had once praised the philanthropic couple, now carrying the weight of collective guilt for having missed the signs. Detective John Johnson attended these vigils faithfully, his face weathered by the years, but his eyes still sharp with vigilance. A simple stone monument stood at the garden's center, engraved with words Elizabeth Smith had chosen. "For those who suffered in silence, your voices are now heard forever." The oldest of the Smith children had helped plant many of the trees herself, digging her hands into the soil where her prison had once stood, reclaiming the ground with each spadeful of earth. The garden became more than a memorial. It transformed into a promise. Teachers brought students there to learn about protecting the vulnerable. Social workers conducted training sessions beneath the spreading branches. The community that had once turned a blind eye now kept its eyes permanently open, determined that no facade of respectability would ever again mask such cruelty. Elizabeth Smith stood beneath the flowering cherry tree in the community garden, its delicate pink blossoms drifting down around her like snow. 20 years had passed since the Smiths' crimes had been exposed, yet the weight of those memories still pressed upon her shoulders. Today, however, she had come to shed that burden. A small crowd gathered around her, survivors, journalists, and community members who had come to witness her first public testimony. The garden, built on the ruins of the Victorian mansion that had been her prison, now bloomed with life and colour where once there had been only darkness. "I was 7 when they brought me to this place," Elizabeth began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "For years, I believed I deserved what happened here. That was Margaret's greatest power, convincing us we were broken and only she could fix us." The audience listened in stunned silence as the oldest Smith adoptee recounted rituals of isolation, psychological manipulation, and the desperate ways she had tried to protect the younger children. She spoke of Thomas's broken arm, of the children hidden on the 3rd floor, and of those who never made it out alive. "Robert and Margaret created a perfect illusion," she continued. "Their philanthropy was just another locked door behind which they hid their cruelty. But Detective Johnson, Susan Davis, and Maria Garcia refused to look away. They saved us when everyone else believed the facade." Emily Davis, now a prominent child welfare advocate, wiped tears from her eyes as Elizabeth acknowledged her mother's sacrifice. The daughter of the determined social worker had transformed her mother's legacy into sweeping reforms that had already protected thousands of vulnerable children. "The truth doesn't heal all wounds," Elizabeth said, looking up at the memorial trees swaying gently in the spring breeze. "But it prevents new ones. Every time we speak up, we make it harder for monsters to hide behind respectable masks." When she finished speaking, the crowd remained silent for a long moment before erupting into applause. Many approached her afterward, some to share their own stories of abuse and survival, others to apologize for having been deceived by the Smiths' charade. As twilight fell over Millfield, Elizabeth remained in the garden alone, touching the smooth bark of the cherry tree. The mansion's shadow no longer loomed over the town, but its lessons endured. That evil often wears a smile, that courage comes in many forms, and that even the most carefully constructed lies eventually crumble before the persistent light of truth.